Thanks for the plug, Lowell.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Lowell Cohn. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. We're thrilled to be offering free online events during these times to keep our community together while we're forced to be separated. As COVID-19 continues to endanger the future of independent bookstores like us, you can show your support for Copperfield's and help keep us alive by purchasing a book through our online store. We appreciate your continued support. So a couple of quick house cleaning items before I introduce tonight's author. We will be utilizing the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links for purchasing Lowell's latest title, Gloves Off, and will also include my contact details for post-event questions and information. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any questions or comments for the author. The format for tonight's event will feature 15 to 20 minutes of speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A icon. Please submit your questions here rather than replying to my post in the chat box, as this will be much more convenient for the live Q&A. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker for the evening, Mr. Lowell Cohn. Lowell is a sports columnist who wrote for our very own Santa Rosa Press Democrat and San Francisco Chronicle. He has been published in Sports Illustrated, as well as the New York Times, and was Sports Columnist of the Year in the San Francisco Bay Area 8 times. Recently retired, he lives in Oakland, California with his wife. And I'm also super thrilled to introduce his latest title, which is Gloves Off, 40 Years of Unfiltered Sports Writing. This is Lowell Cohn's tell-all book that takes you into the rarefied world of sports that you can't see from the confines of your newspaper. From wild locker room conflicts to bizarre player interviews to heartfelt conversations with the heroes of the athletic world, Lowell Cohn has seen it all. 4 decades inside the press box provide an unparalleled collection of anecdotes and interactions that reveal Cohn's insider perspective and unvarnished opinions on some of the sports world's most well-known personalities, including Bill Walsh, Barry Bonds, Michael Jordan, Sugar Ray Robinson, Steve Young, and many more. What a lineup. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Lowell.
Thanks, Jamie. Jamie said I should hold the book up in front of my face.
Yes.
So I'm holding the book up so you can see it, and it's better than my face, believe me. What I'm going to do is, first of all, thank you so much for being here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a short 3-page chapter from the book. Then I'll talk a little about me and my background, and then I'll throw it open to Q&A. So here's one of the chapters. Most of the chapters are about very famous people, but this is a Friday night, and I'm thinking about home in Brooklyn, and this is a story about my dad and me that took place a long time ago. It's called Field of Dreams, Baseball and the Afterlife. My father treated me to a Mets-Dodgers doubleheader in May 1962. The Dodgers had moved from Brooklyn to LA in 1958, broke my heart and lots of hearts, and now they were returning to New York for the first time. I was 16. We took the subway to the Polo Grounds where the Giants used to play, where the Mets would play until they got Shea Stadium in Queens. I had never been to the Polo Grounds. It looked like a relic. Old wood in that strange big center field. My dad bought us seats in left field, bathed in sun glow. I need to tell you something about my father. He was legally blind. He could see enough to walk down the street, and he could make out shapes on the screen in a movie theater, but he couldn't read the newspaper or books. He was a trial lawyer, and the night before a case, my brother or my sister or I would read him the legal files, and he would memorize them. Okay, so my dad and I were at the Polo Grounds, and the crowd was enormous for this Dodgers homecoming, 55,704 people. It was game 2 of the doubleheader, top of the 6th, and the Dodgers had Maury Wills on second, Jim Gillian on first with no one out. Willie Davis crushed a hard liner to Elio Chacon of the Mets at shortstop. Chacon caught the liner, then threw to Charlie Neal, doubling off Wills at second base. Neal threw to Gil Hodges at first, tripling off Gilliam, just like that. The crowd went nuts. I never heard noise like that. When it was all over and the crowd had settled down, my father gently touched my hand and said, I've never forgotten this. He said, "Lowly, what just happened?" He didn't know. He couldn't see. He saw nothing. He took me to the Polo Grounds to make me happy, and he would be happy giving me happiness. I loved my dad. I explained the Mets had pulled off a triple play, and he smiled. "You don't say," he said. And I had helped him. He needed me that moment, and I delivered just as I delivered years later when he was an old man visiting me in California, and I held his hand crossing a busy Oakland street. We came together in the Polo Grounds through baseball, and it was the medium of our meeting. He had bequeathed me his love of ball, a gift from his generation to mine, and now mine to my sons. Baseball continuous, always there. Same with football and basketball and whatever sports you shared with your folks and children. Sports, a topic bonding Americans, strangers breaking the ice with, "How about those Niners?" Or, "It's time the Giants got a good closer." Sports, the universal glue. Sports, a secular religion with heroes and demigods and athletes we invest with our best qualities. Sports, a world filled with moral tales of right and wrong, of weak and strong. Sports giving us the chance to rejoice and to grieve. My father died in 1988. A year later, I was in New York. One afternoon, I ducked into a movie theater to see Field of Dreams. Do you remember that lovely film? At the end, Kevin Costner meets his dad, long dead, but his dad miraculously is a young man. They had endured a fractious relationship when the father was alive, but now on this magical ball field, they play catch. A father and son communicating through throw and receive. And I started to cry. God, did I cry. Choked, strangled sobs, salty hot tears pouring down my face. When the movie ended, I remained in the dark theater, head down, didn't dare to walk into the lobby with my wet, red face. I cried for my dad through a baseball flick. It felt so bad and so good. Field of Dreams brought my dad and me together after he died. My father in that dark theater holding my hand. So that's me and my dad. I'll tell you a little bit about me and about how I came to write this book and to be a sports writer. I got a few notes, so bear with me. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s and 1960s. And because of, I guess, my personality and the way I grew up, I didn't talk. I talked. That's how I learned. I talked. Well, I didn't talk like regular people. I didn't say mother and father. I said mudda and fada. I didn't realize they weren't pronounced mudda and fada until I went away to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania in 1962. In 1966, I applied for graduate school in English. I thought I wanted to be a professor of English. So I got into Stanford, and my mother had said, don't just apply on the East Coast. You should apply to a school on the West Coast because you always get a lot of colds, and it's warmer in California. So apply to Stanford. So I never heard of Stanford. So I applied and I got in, and I thought Stanford was in Los Angeles. Anyway, I still get a lot of colds, so that didn't work. I spent 6 years at Stanford. I did a master's and a PhD. My PhD was a dissertation on Joseph Conrad, which I don't think added that much to the world of knowledge. And what I realized after I finished there in 1972, Stanford had prepared me for life in the Middle Ages. And I decided I wanted to be in the latter half of the 20th century. So I decided not to be a professor, and I started to be a freelance writer. What I wanted was action. I love to see my byline. I like to see my stuff get printed. So I started as a freelance film and drama critic at the Palo Alto Times, which a wonderful paper that no longer exists. And I was a film critic, and I get $10 a review. After the first year, the editor, who's such a sweet guy, called me and said, "We love your reviews. We're going to give you a 25% raise." So after the first year, I was getting $12.50 a review, and I was happy to get it. I also would freelance articles for Sports Illustrated. They liked my writing, and I got some stuff in there. And then I sent one of my features to the San Francisco Chronicle almost as a lark. And they said, "We like your writing. Would you come in for an interview?" So I went to the Chronicle, and they said, "We'll hire you to be a sports columnist." I had never had a job my whole life. I was almost 34. "And we want you to be not like an insider, but someone who writes from the outside and sees things a different way." And it was interesting, and I could certainly be an outsider because I wasn't an insider. I can tell you that every sports writer in the Bay Area hated my guts because I had not, quote unquote, paid my dues. I had been somewhere else that they didn't know. And I was really resented for a long time. And had I been them, I would have hated my guts because I jumped the whole line and became one of the columnists at the Chronicle, which was the leading paper, and I guess still is, in Northern California. I was there 1979 through the beginning of 1995. I eventually was not happy there. I got a call early in 1995 from the Press Democrat. They said, "We've heard that you're not happy at the Chronicle. Will you talk to us?" Hell yeah. So I talked to them. They offered me really good money. And at the time, they were owned by the New York Times. So although they didn't have the circulation of the Chronicle, they had so much more, including an employee stock plan, which we didn't have at the Chronicle. I went there in 95 and was there for 22 years until 3 years ago. And they did for me what you want your editors and your publishers to do. They left me alone. They trusted me. They never interfered with what I was going to write. They never even asked me what I was going to write. And it was a wonderful, wonderful relationship. When I retired, I was telling Jamie before this started, I didn't know what I was going to do. I mean, I was 71. I had always been a busy person. I thought, am I going to be one of these people who sort of pines away and dies? My wife said, "Why don't you just start writing some essays about sports and about your career?" And I started doing it, and I found I was pretty good at it. I liked doing it, and it kept me alive. It kept me sort of young. So I wrote these are 64 vignettes, short stories in the book. They're almost all of them in dramatic form. They have characters and dialogue. They are all true. They are all nonfiction. Why do I want to write? Aside from the fact that I can't stop, I understand my life as I write, and I love to hear the voice in my head that's saying the words that I want to write. The voice is 11 years old. It's the last year of my life that I was completely happy. It's innocent, the 11-year-old voice, in the sense that it tells what it sees, not what it's supposed to see or expected to see. Sports teams, I would say politicians too, want people who cover them to see the world the way they narrate it, the team or the politicians. The team puts a lot of pressure on you. When the 49ers were not good, and that was very recent, there was a lot of pressure to write they were improving, they were very good already. I refused. I didn't get in. I didn't make that much money in this job, but I got in to tell the truth. Okay. I wrote this book because these are stories, for the most part, I could not tell in a newspaper. The world of sports is a lot of, I dealt with men mostly, a lot of grown men, but not all that grown up, and a lot of it is pretty raunchy. and too rude to be in a newspaper, which is a family organ, but it's perfect for a book. And I was dying to write these stories. They are almost all about famous people and me, and I am always a character in the story. Jamie mentioned some of the people I write about: Bill Walsh, Steve Young, Joe Montana, Al Davis, Don Nelson, Jim Harbaugh, Michael Jordan, Jose Canseco, Charles Schultz. That was a bit of a stretch to get him in a sports book. Dwayne Kuiper, Steve Mariucci, Bruce Bochy, Dusty Baker, on and on and on. And there was one other thing. I wanted to use curse words. The 11-year-old in me again. He loves to curse. Everyone in sports curses. It's the verbal medium we move across. And now I could use all the bad words I couldn't use in a newspaper, and I loved it. My son Grant, who is listening to this right now and who covers the 49ers for Sports Illustrated, told me my columns were not me, that they were too polite. You're a cursor, he said to me, and that made me proud. So that's who I am. I'm a cursor, although I don't think I'm going to curse here because kids might watch it. Before we move on, I'd love to open this up to questions from you, but I want to make a plug for independent bookstores. When I worked at the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, I didn't go up there all that often, maybe 4 or 5 times a year for meetings, editorial meetings. Obviously, I live in Oakland, and that's where all the sports are here in San Francisco and Santa Clara. But when I would go to Santa Rosa, at that time, the Copperfield was right on 4th Street, and it was a beautiful store that I loved to go to. Now they're in Montgomery Village. I feel, for me, the independent bookstore is sort of the hub. It's the glue that holds it. There are other glues, of course, as well, but libraries, bars, I guess. But independent bookstores are places that I've spent my life feeling comfortable, not feeling rushed, loving to buy the books and loving to support a local business. So if you have an urge after we're all done tonight to buy my book, I hope you'll buy it at a Copperfield's or at an independent bookstore. That's it for me. Jamie, do you want to lead me on from here?
Yes, that was fantastic. Thanks, Lowell. So we have quite a few questions here. The first one is from David Clare, and he's wondering, was Bill Walsh a hard or an easy interview?
Oh, that's a really good question to start with. Bill Walsh was a very easy interview. Bill Walsh was a brilliant, brilliant man, and he was savvy. So he knew before I walked into the room what I wanted. He knew the interview probably before I knew the interview, and he was very good at directing me so I would have 2 things, a good article and I would make him look good. He wasn't what my mother would call a schmuck. He was a smart guy. So he was a very easy interview in the sense of it always came out well. But would he tell me deep down secrets about Joe Montana or Jerry Rice? No, he was very protective, as he should have been. And there was very little stuff at the time he was the coach that he would tell me that revealed deep secrets about the Niners. But, and here's the interesting thing, when he retired, he completely reversed. He used to call me, we used to talk on the phone a lot. He would call me and tell me stuff that would turn my hair blue. And I used to say, how come you never told me this when I was writing about it? He said, I couldn't then, but I love to do it now. So yes, he became a source later on. But when he was the coach, he was a great interview, but would never throw his people under the bus, which I admired.
Kind of along those lines, David has a follow-up question. Can you compare interviewing Bill Walsh with Jim Harbaugh?
I can. I want to preface by saying Jim Harbaugh was a very difficult personality for the media to deal with. Having said that, I really like Jim Harbaugh. I have tremendous affection for him. And if you look at the book, there are 3 testimonials, you might say, on the back. I'm wrong. I have an afterword in the book, and Jim Harbaugh wrote it for me. He wrote the afterword. So we became, again, you don't really become friends with these people, but we became close. Now, Bill Walsh would talk endlessly, and my son is listening, I think he would agree. If you wanted to do an interview with Harbaugh, he was, I would say, almost paranoid. Why are you asking that question? What are you trying to uncover? Are you sneaky? That kind of thing. So after a while, I gave up on getting one-on-one interviews with him because I'd get an ulcer. I'd sit there and I'd have acid reflux. I'd get an ulcer. But what would happen was he would do several news conferences with us a week with all the local media. And you could really get your yayas out with him. You could yell at him. He could yell at you. He could tell you you didn't know what you were talking about. You could tell him he didn't know what he was talking about. And you really did business. And it was sports writing as competition, because everything with Harbaugh is competition, everything. And I loved it and loved him for it.
Wow. Okay, this next one is from Steve Harmon, and it's kind of a long one, so I'll just get in there. So first, he wants to say he adored your book, and he has actually laughed and cried tears. It's just wonderful. So his question is, your friend's comment, filtered from Yiddish, "You went to Stanford for this," is hilarious. There seems to be a lot of irony in your story as a sports writer. Do you really see yourself as a sports writer? It seems so pedestrian a description of what you did. I mean, I was a sports writer for 7 years, never had the freedom to contemplate life as you did. So really, would you call yourself a philosopher or a poet, or would you call all sports writers poets and philosophers?
What a lovely question. Steve Harmon was a terrific sports writer at the Sacramento Bee, and my son who's listening, he is my son's, when my son was a kid, his best friend was Julian, and Steve is his uncle. So hello, Steve, and hello, Julian. Steve, when I became a columnist at the Chronicle, one of my best friends was an older man, 23 years older than I was, he's dead now, who was the head of the French and Italian department at Stanford. And when I became a sports writer, he said, Lowell, don't be like the rest of them. You're not a sports writer. You are, quote, a writer who writes about sports. And I always thought about that. I don't know if I'm a philosopher, but I always tried to be a writer who was writing about that subject, meaning as much as possible, and I failed thousands of times, I tried to have dialogue, not quotes. I had people as they talked to each other. I had people moving in rooms, out of rooms. I tried to reveal characters as they were, as they opened to me. So what I was trying to do in certain columns was to write creative nonfiction, was to write little short stories the way a fiction writer would, but writing them about real people with true facts and the truth. So that's what now, of course, there are other kinds of columns that are just pure opinion. The third baseman sucks, they should trade him. That's not particularly philosophical, but you know, you love to write that. You don't like to face the third baseman after that, but you have to. But that's a different, the genre is multiple, but there was a certain part of it where I saw it as writing about, I guess it sounds so hoity-toity, the human condition, or at least real human beings.
Well, that's what makes you tremendously unique, I suppose, right?
I don't know if I'm unique. I don't know.
Hey, all right, so we've got quite a few questions here. Marshall Comstock wants to know your thoughts on the current dispute between MLB players and their owners.
Marshall was a student of mine at University of San Francisco. Marshall is one hell of a writer. Marshall, I'm with the players. I'm always with the players. I guess the players right now feel they're getting squeezed by management if they, you know, they want to prorate them and then take more money away from them after that. I'm 100% with the players. Hi, Marshall.
That's so personable. I love it. Okay, the next question is from Bruce Dichter, and I hope I said that right. The famous figures shine a bright light and there's a long afterglow. but are there relatively minor sports figures that occupy a warm place in your heart that you think fondly of?
Okay, that's very interesting. I can answer that question, and I want to. Um, Years ago on the Giants, there were people who were not very famous. The shortstop, Johnny LeMaster. Jamie, you never heard of him. He was from Kentucky. He was just such a sweet guy. One time, I had to go to the Palo Alto clinic. I was getting an injection or something, and he was driving in with his wife, and they came in the parking lot as I was walking toward the door, and he honked the horn, and I stopped. His wife was in the passenger seat with the door down, and I'm sorry, the window down, and Debbie. And I said, "Hi, Debbie." And she looked at Johnny and she said, "Am I allowed to talk to Lowell?" Because he probably told her, "You can't trust the media." You know what I mean? And he said, "Yeah, you could talk to him. It's okay." So it was very sweet. And another time, I had gone on a road trip and I was young. I was my first year. The Giants were playing the Mets in Queens at Shea Stadium, but they stayed in Manhattan. So someone said, "Do you want to come on the team bus?" Well, a writer never does that. They hate you. So, but I didn't know. So I got on the bus and they were screaming at me and they were calling me names and the bus had already started. So I just didn't know what to do. I was standing there feeling intimidated. Johnny LeMaster reached out his hand. There was an open seat next to him and he grabbed me and he said, "Sit by me, you'll be safe." I love him. Are you kidding? Sit by me, you'll be safe. Another player with the Giants who came later was a guy named Jeffrey Leonard. He was their left fielder. He was a tough guy from Philadelphia, and he made everybody scared. Everybody. Um, in his photo in the media guide, it looked like one of those mugshots if you got arrested, and people called him penitentiary face. They called Jeffrey Leonard. But he was such a sweet guy. One time, I wrote that he was a crummy left fielder. And then you got to go. You can't not go. So the next day I went, but I was like trembling because I thought the penitentiary face, he'll hit me or he'll yell at me. And I was really nervous. So I'm standing there waiting for it. And all of a sudden, Lowell, come over here. So I went over and I thought, oh, here we go. And he says, "Look at this." And he points to the side of his locker. But I was so nervous, I couldn't see. So I said, "What?" He goes, "Would you please look at this?" So I look. And he had cut out and pasted the article from the Chronicle where I said he was a crummy left fielder. And he said, "Look, I want to thank you for writing that." He said, "This is all the motivation I need to be a really good left fielder. Let's shake hands. We're friends from now on." Are you kidding me? I love him. He handled it. He was the adult in the room, and I was the 11-year-old. So I would say off the top of my head, my answer would be two guys I just loved were LeMaster and Leonard. Others, famous ones, Dusty Baker is probably my all-time favorite. And Steve Harmon would know this. My son would know this. Anyone who ever dealt with Dusty Baker, he's a mensch. He's the greatest, loveliest, most interesting guy. A close second is Steve Young. He's just a dream.
Oh my goodness. Well, we from one Jew to another, we had this conversation before. I just love that you used mensch. And along those lines, your son Grant is wondering, why does Lowell have such an admiration for Dusty Baker?
Oh, well, okay. When I was at the Chronicle, one of the reasons I left is was not getting along well with management. It was partly my fault for not being mature enough, but it was their fault for being crummy, I thought. And at a certain point, they said, "You're not going to be a columnist anymore. You're going to cover Stanford sports." This was for a few months before I went to the Press Democrat. Well, a day or two after that happened, the phone rings, and it was Dusty Baker. And now I can't say what he said, but he said, expletive them, Lowell. He said, "Look, you're the greatest. Expletive them, hold your head high." That's what he told me. And there was no reason for him to do that. I was out and he had nothing to gain. He was just being a good guy. So there was that. And then there was another very interesting time with him. I knew a guy who was a graphologist, and that is someone who can analyze your handwriting. And they can really do interesting things. They can read your handwriting and say, are you a bold person? Are you timid? Are you all kinds of adjectives and all kinds of personality traits. So what I did, I went out and bought a bunch of baseball cards. And on baseball cards, they have the signature of the player. So I brought them to a graphologist, and he had one proviso. He said, the signature is a little different from regular handwriting, but there are things I can tell from it anyway. So he analyzed Dusty's, and he said, he has a strong sex drive. That's what he said. I thought that was great, so I put it in the article. So with the copy of his handwriting. So the next time I saw Dusty, he calls me over and we're alone. He goes, Lowell, we get along, right? I said, sure, Dusty, we get along. He goes, you know that thing you wrote about my sex drive? He says, you got me in trouble with my wife. I said, what are you talking about? He says, well, you said I have a strong sex drive. She thinks I'm messing around on the road. And she thinks you know that I'm messing around on the road. And I just started to laugh. And again, he wasn't angry at me. He just like, why did you do that to me? And I said, oh, gee, Dusty, I have no idea what you do on the road. And I said, I'll tell you what, may I write a letter to your wife and apologize and explain? And he goes, no. I'll tell her what we said. And I'll never forget, he said, you're okay by me. That's what he said. You're okay by me. Me, I would have been angry, but I got him in trouble because he said he had a strong sex drive from his handwriting. How the hell did I know?
That's hilarious. Oh my goodness. Okay, right now, the last Dusty Baker question is, John Armato wants you to rate Dusty Baker compared to other Giants managers.
Well, that's a really good question. He got them into the World Series. He has a lot of wins. He was a very, very, very good Giants manager. So was Roger Craig. Roger Craig was a hell of a manager. I would put them close to each other. I would have to put Bruce Bochy, I'd say a little above both of them. Bruce won 3 world championships. No matter what you say, I think he should still be managing that club. I don't understand why not. So for me, the guys that I worked with were all A's. Maybe Dusty and Roger Craig were A, and Bochy was A+.
Huh. Well, another anonymous question is, what was the real Bruce Bochy like? A good guy or a hard-driving manager?
Both. A hard-driving manager can be a good guy. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Of course, I mostly knew Bochy from dealing with him as the media. And what I found with him, there was no question that would offend him. You can't imagine how pleasant that is. There are some people, every question offends them. Colin Kaepernick, every question offended him. Is the sky blue? He'd be offended. Bruce Bochy never would be offended. He always tried to see where you were coming from, and he would try his hardest to do well for you. In addition, you could talk to Bruce away from groups. He had, when you walked into the Giants clubhouse, there was a hallway, and then there'd be the clubhouse at the far end of it. But to the left side, before you got in the clubhouse, was his office. If the door was closed, of course, you couldn't go in, but he'd leave it open. And he'd be just sitting at his desk, looking at the ceiling, whatever. And I would take advantage of those moments because I liked him and I wanted to learn things. So I would sit at a little couch and he and I would chat. Now, you may not know this, but he is a big wine collector. Loves Sonoma County wine. Well, he had in his office, it looked like a refrigerator, but it had a glass front. And it's one of those humidifiers that keeps the wine at a temperature and a humidity. And he would go and show me all his bottles, and he would be so proud to do it. So I liked him very much. Hard driving manager. I think he was especially hard on his coaches. This is what I heard. Bill Walsh was the same way. He expected excellence from his coaches. And my guess is he could be quite blunt and sometimes a little, I would say, insensitive with his coaches. maybe sometimes with his players, but my guess was he was more old style and was a little distant from his players. Dusty Baker was the kind of guy who would bring sandwiches for his players or sit and chat with them. No, Bochy, you never saw him in the clubhouse. Dusty would be there. Bochy was removed. He was like a CEO, that kind of thing. He managed, but he also managed through his coaches. And I think he could be very demanding of them and sometimes make them a little tired of him. Having said that, I thought he was a great guy and an absolutely great manager.
Gosh, this is such interesting insight. I mean, really appreciate you sharing this with us. Marianne Johnston is wondering, who was your toughest interview?
Okay. That's a tough question. Toughest interview can mean two things. It can mean who was a real jerk. Okay? It could mean that, or it could mean who was very complex and it was hard to break through. So I'm going to answer it both ways. Jerk. There were two that stand out. Barry Bonds was, I would say, insufferable. I don't know why he was that way, but he made life very hard between him and the media. Now, he's retired, and people who know him say he's really quite nice. And I can understand that. Players sort of need a rage, to be in a rage in order to play, and maybe he needed that. Worse than him was Colin Kaepernick. He enjoyed humiliating the media, and there was no reason to do it. We are hardworking people. Most of us who covered him at the time when he was with the Niners were hardworking and respectful of him. Respectful. He would make a point of answering our questions, which were legitimate questions, in the fewest possible words, and I believe he got off on it. So the journalists would keep track. Often, our questions would have more words than his answers. And it was a way of saying, screw you, I don't respect you, I won't move an inch for you. And there were a lot of other things he did. I found him a tough interview because he was such a rude, immature, unpleasant person. He may be God's gift right now. I haven't talked to him in about 3 or 4 years, but that's what I felt about him. Now, others, someone who's complex and is hard to get through to and makes you work. Tony La Russa, a Hall of Fame manager who managed the Oakland A's, he was that way, and I liked it. Tony is a lawyer. He went to law school. He's quite intelligent, and he knows how to argue, because I think you probably learn those skills in law school. So when I would interview Tony, if I didn't phrase my question in exactly the right way, he would question my question. By the way, Jim Harbaugh would do that too. And he is also extremely bright. So he was another one, but I've already talked about Harbaugh. I'll stick with Tony. So there would be sparring, verbal sparring, where I would have to redefine my question. And what was happening was he was taking over. Instead of me asking him, he was now directing the words, the pace, the subject matter, and grading my questions. And I found it fascinating. I loved it. I loved to be able to reach the point where he would answer me. And when I did, he paid off. He would answer everything. He would tell me stuff on the record, off the record, that kind of thing. But I had to earn it. And I knew going in there, it would be a verbal boxing match. And it was, for me, a wonderful part of my life. Tony La Russa.
That's a great answer. Okay, so one that's a personal question of mine. I had the chance to thumb through this, and I love this book. But it's not just about the Bill Walshes or the Randy Mosses or the Joe Montanas, right? Since we're back in the Bay Area and in Sonoma County, there's a particular vignette that I think will really interest our viewers about Charles Schultz. And I'm wondering if you can quickly tell us a little bit about that and maybe the Pulitzer Prize story.
Sure, I'd love to. What happened was, when I was working at the Press Democrat, whenever there was a big sports story in, say, Sonoma County, they would want me to come up from Oakland and write about it. And I love to do it. I love Santa Rosa and the whole area up there. So Charles Schultz had an ice rink. And once a year, he would have this thing called the Snoopy ice hockey tournament, which was for old guys, for a senior ice hockey tournament. So my editor said, would you please, Charles Schultz will meet you in the cafeteria there in Santa Rosa. Would you interview him and write a story about Charles Schultz and a Snoopy tournament? Hell yeah. Plus, I would get to meet Charles Schultz, who created Peanuts. I mean, just a genius, a flat out genius. So I drove up. And again, usually when I would interview people, I wouldn't be nervous at all. I felt very confident that I could hold my own with sports figures. But this wasn't a sports figure. This was Charles Schultz. So I went in and he was sitting waiting for me. And Jamie, he looked like the president. He was handsome. He had gray hair combed back. I mean, he looked like from central casting, a senator or the president. And I sat down and I said, hi, Mr. Schultz. I'm Lowell Cohn. And he said, not Mr. Schultz, Sparky. Call me Sparky. And I was like, whoa, I'm calling Charles Schultz Sparky? It would be like calling Franklin Delano Roosevelt Frankie. So all afternoon, I'm calling, hey, Sparky, and hey, Sparky. And he seemed to like it. So I was calling him Sparky. And then we were sitting, I think we had a Coke, and I interviewed him and we chatted, and he started to show me stuff talk about his drawing, his creative life. And he said, look, Lowell, my hand is shaking a little now. I'm not young anymore. And he said, so I draw every day, but I have to hold my right hand with my left hand so I could guide my drawing and keep it so it's not fuzzy. And it was very interesting. And all of a sudden, like LaRussa, he started interviewing me. And it's interesting that the really special people do that. And he said, we're kind of in the same business. I mean, you have to produce every day, and I have to produce every day. He says, do you ever not have an idea? And I said, Sparky, at least once a week, I go to bed. I have to write the next morning a column, and I go to bed, and I don't have an idea, and I'm tossing and turning all night. And finally, my wife throws the penalty flag and kicks me. He's saying, you're keeping me up, kicks me out of the bedroom. And he said, you know what, Lowell? Pretty much me too. About once a week, I don't have an idea for Peanuts, and I'm going crazy, and my wife kicks me out. So he says, well, how do you get ideas? And this is Charles Schultz asking me. This is Sparky asking me. So I said, well, there's usually a lot going on in sports. So if I don't have an idea, I wake up early and I go through the papers. And I think this might have even been before the internet. I said, I go through the papers and, I often can get something. He goes, me too. I look through the papers and there are things there. And then he says, well, what happens even then if you don't have an idea? And I could see, here's him. He's a billionaire, is sweating it as much as I am. And he wanted help. And I said, you know what, Sparky? The Lord provides. And he said, Lowell, I found that too. The Lord provides. And then he says, I have one other question for you. He said, the big hurt in my life is I never got the Pulitzer Prize. What do you think of that? And it was like now therapy. We were doing psychotherapy. And I said, Sparky, I didn't know that you didn't get a Pulitzer. He goes, they don't give it for cartoons. They don't give it. So I said, no kidding. And I could see it really hurt him. So I said, Sparky, here's the thing. You're too good for the Pulitzer Prize. That's what I told him. And he said, yeah, that's it. Thank you. And I made Sparky Schultz's day. Then he went back to his billion-dollar life. I went back to mine, except there was one other thing. He was so sweet. He said, I've really enjoyed this. Would you and your wife come up and have dinner up here with my wife and me? We would really love it. And I said, oh, yeah, Sparky, yeah. But Jamie, how things go. And
yeah, you get busy.
I got busy, and then he died. And so he died. And then so I never had dinner with him. But I'm so glad you brought up that chapter, because that one, very few of these chapters have appeared before, but that one ran in the Press Democrat. There were about, I think, 12 of the 64 stories either are from the Press Democrat, the Chronicle, or Sports Illustrated, and the other 52 or something are all new for the book.
It's just such a special story, and I'm so glad you included it. We revere Charles Schultz up here.
He was a nice man. He's a very nice man.
And I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you. Okay, so we've trekking through these questions. Marshall Comstock, also wants to know, you've interviewed a lot of famous people, but you're pretty well known yourself in the Bay Area. Any interesting stories about people or fans recognizing you in public?
That's a good one, Marshall. When I wrote for the Chronicle, my picture was, at that time, they did not put your picture in the paper. So people didn't really know me by sight, but my face was on the side of buses. They had, you know how they do these promotion things, and they had Lowell Cohn with my face on it. Great people make a great newspaper. So I remember one night, I went with my wife to the Washington Square Bar and Grill in North Beach, which was the most trendy restaurant in the city at that time. And there was a line out the door. And, my wife said, let's stay. It's, we like the place. It's a nice night. So we were really like down the block. All of a sudden, someone came out of the restaurant and said, Mr. Cohn, yeah, come with me. Look, it's in. We jumped the whole line. And I got to tell you, I'm Jewish. I feel guilty. I still feel guilty. But they gave us a great table. And I realized that was the first time that I was actually kind of well known. That happened at the Washington Square Bar and Grill. What happens to me up in Sonoma County, especially Healdsburg, I'm a wine guy. So when there isn't COVID-19 and I'm not in place, I like maybe once every 2 months, I go on my own sometimes to just go to some wineries. And very often they'll, because my picture was in the PD. And then all of a sudden I notice I'm getting extra tastes or extra, would you like to taste this library wine? Or this is like 100 years old. Not really. It's 30. And I realized that I'm getting special treatment. Here's the thing. I don't need it, but I love it. You know what I mean? I don't need it, but when it happens, I don't say, oh no. I think this is really cool. Yeah. So up in Dry Creek.
I love that. As a person who lives in Healdsburg, I can join you.
Come with me. We'll have a good time.
Yeah. Okay, so David Clare is wondering, how do you think Eddie D would have handled the Colin Kaepernick situation?
Wow. Okay. One, it's hard for me to speak for Eddie. Eddie is quite a personality and quite intelligent. It would have not just been Eddie. It would have been Eddie and his guy, Carmen Policy, and Bill Walsh. It would have been those three. Here's my guess. I think they would have allowed him to kneel because I think it was okay that he kneeled. I think they would have allowed him to talk about his political agenda, but not in the locker room. What he did that year was, after games, he would hold court and talk about his agenda. But the team had just played a game, and you were there to do business, not to talk about politics. I don't believe they would have allowed him to take over the locker room, which I felt was unfair to the other 55 players and to all the coaches. This was a place of business. The coach at the time was a weakling named Chip Kelly, and he let that happen. The general manager, Trent Baalke, let it happen, and Jed York, the owner, was not up to it. I think he's better now, and let it happen. And I think their locker room was a shambles because they allowed Colin to take over on non-football matters in a business place. I could not have done that at the Press Democrat. I could not have said, nobody can work or talk here. I want to talk about whatever. I think what they would have done, Bill, Eddie, and Carmen would have told very politely, Colin, you're absolutely entitled to talk about what you want to talk about. Please leave the locker room and go in the hallway outside. The media can follow you who want to write about that. And this way, you'll have more space for you in the media. It'll be quieter, and you won't be intruding on other media and players who want to talk about the game that we just finished. I think that would have been a really fair and equitable way to handle it. Or I bet they might have rented Colin, there's a hotel down the street, might have rented a room for him, a ballroom, and said, please, we'll rent this. Talk as long as you want. Have media in here. Just please not in the locker room. And I think they would have found an equitable way to handle that equation, which the people who did it at that time, in my opinion, really flubbed.
I mean, what a controversy. It's just over the top.
Yep.
Okay, let's run it back a little bit to the beginning. Eric Kimmel is wondering, who was your very first interview?
Eric Kimmel. I'm going to tell you, Eric, this is my friend that we grew up together who wrote Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. Eric, when I was at Stanford and I finished, I mentioned that I had this mentor, Alphonse Riand, who I called the prof, the head of the French and Italian department. And I finished there at 26. I was at 28. And I was with him one day and I said, you know, I just don't know what to be when I grow up. And my parents in Brooklyn are getting nervous. And he had this French way of speaking, but he said it in English. He said, Lowell, what makes you catch fire? That's what he said. What makes you catch fire? Meaning, what are you really interested in? What gets you in your gut? And I said, well, you know, I like to write and I like sports. And he goes, my dear Lowell, that's what he said, my dear Lowell, let me remind you, there's such a thing called a sports writer. So, okay, I had this epiphany and I said, I'll tell you what, could I write my first article about you? The thing about Alphonse, the head of the French department at Stanford, he was a sprinter. He was a little over 50 at the time, and he was the fastest runner in the world for men over 50 years old. He held the record in the 100 and the 200 meters. So he said, sure. So I wrote an article about him and I called it The Existential Sprinter. And it ran, the Examiner at that time had a Sunday magazine. And it ran in that Sunday magazine and it was a big hit. And it was what got me launched. They saw it at Sports Illustrated later on. They liked it. So my first interview, Eric, was Alphonse Riand, the prof.
Wow. Grant is wondering, what makes a good sports writer?
Well, I'm going to say right now, a good sports writer is a reader. Grant, are you listening to me? To be any kind of a serious writer, you have to be reading all the time. And I don't mean just newspapers or other sports writers or even great columnists. You have to be reading great writers like Eric Kimmel. You have to be reading Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, Charles Dickens. You have to be reading, you have to hear that music in your head. And you have to really, really want to make something that matters. You have to know Strunk and White. You have to have declarative sentences with active verbs, and you have to write noun, verb, noun, verb. When my son was applying for a job at a TV station in San Francisco, and I won't mention which one, the managing editor of their website in the interview told my son, who had grown up in a writer's house, the most important thing is to have good adjectives. And he came back and he told me, Dad, I knew she was a schmuck right then and there. And she didn't know what she was talking about. I try to use as few adjectives as possible. And I never, ever, if I can, use an adverb. Noun, verb, active verbs.
Words from
and
the words.
And one more thing. You have to always write, what do I see and what do I hear? Not what am I supposed to see and hear? What does it really look like and what does it really sound like, even if I offend them?
Well, I know we're starting to get near the end and I, want to be mindful of your time. So tell us a little bit about what's next for you.
Well, when I finished this book was actually about a year ago. Jamie, it takes a long time to produce a book and bring it out. I immediately started another memoir, and this one is not sports. It has 3 parts. It's about growing up in Brooklyn. It's about going to Stanford, and that was quite a culture shock for me. Brooklyn goes to Stanford. And then it's about my life in newspapers, Palo Alto Times, Chronicle, Santa Rosa Press Democrat, and I'm almost finished with that. So we'll see. I mean, I would love to get it published. I don't know if it'll have the appeal that Lowell, the sports writer, has, but I've written it with the same care and love. And I'm actually about 2 weeks away from being done with it.
Wow, that's awesome. Does it have a name yet?
What I'm calling it is revenge in a minor key.
Oh, I like that. Well, I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for that. And I'm so thrilled you can make it this evening. And for all of you joining, this book has so much to offer. Everyone can find something, from the young to the old. You know, you even discuss boxing and baseball with your dad, and there's hilarious locker room humor, but there's also heartfelt and deep stories on sports and life and family. And I couldn't recommend it highly enough. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate this. And thanks to Copperfields.
Yeah, thank you. And have a great evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you everyone for attending.